All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome once again to Wild at Work, a stewardship series. My name is Amanda Gobley. I am a conservation education specialist with Texas Wildlife Association, and our topic today is chronic wasting disease, or CWD. So here to provide a more thorough introduction is Texas Wildlife Association CEO, Justin Dreibelbis. I'll hand it over to you, Justin.
Thanks, Amanda. Well, welcome everybody. Certainly appreciate everyone attending this afternoon. And we can tell from the number of people that have signed on, this is a topic that's on a lot of people's minds. My name is Justin Dreibelbis. I work here at Texas Wildlife Association. And for those of you that don't know much about TWA, I'll give you just a quick spiel. We're a landowner and hunter advocacy organization that was formed in San Antonio back in 1985. We now office just north of New Braunfels. We have a very active hunter recruitment and retention program. We have a very active conservation education program, one of which we're watching today. And then we have a very strong presence in Austin at the Texas legislature and dealing with a number of regulatory processes that affect landowners and hunters. And really, at the end of the day, we're trying to make sure that landowners and hunters have a seat at the table on issues that affect them and their ability to manage the land. We have lots of natural resource issues that come up on a regular basis that TWA engages on, and with a skyrocketing population and more demand on our natural resources than ever, that will continue to be the case. One of the issues for the last several years that's risen pretty high on our priority list is chronic wasting disease. We see it as a threat to our hunting economies, our hunting culture here in our state, and it's something to be taken seriously. I think we all have a part to play in the management of it, and we thank Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for their leadership in managing this disease. So today we're lucky to have Mitch Lockwood here from Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to speak to us and give us an update on kind of the latest on chronic wasting disease in our state. Just a little bit about Mitch. Mitch has a bachelor's and master's in wildlife and fishery science from Texas A&M. Spent time with the Florida Game and Fish Commission out of college at the Blackwater WMA. Moved back home to Texas in 2000 as a private lands biologist in the Hill Country. Served as a whitetail program leader starting in 2004 until 2009 when he became the big game program director there at Parks and Wildlife. Mitch has been very crucial in our management plan for chronic wasting disease here in the state, and appreciate your leadership, Mitch. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction, Justin. Certainly want to thank everybody for spending your lunch hour with us to discuss this topic that's very important to us. As Justin mentioned, I'm blessed to get to have this opportunity to be the big game program director for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And so in theory, I guess what that means is I get to dabble in the research and management of all of our big game species, which can be pretty rewarding, as you can imagine, when you're restoring desert bighorn sheep populations to the mountains of West Texas or pronghorn back into the grasslands of the Trans-Pecos. It can be really rewarding. But, unfortunately, for the last several years, what we're here to talk about today has consumed a great deal of not just my time, but the whole team. Most of the big game program, certainly our wildlife health program, formerly with Dr. Bob Dittmar, now with Drs. Reed and Wyckoff. We're fortunate to have a really, really good team, and it extends far beyond Texas Parks and Wildlife. We have really good partners, not just throughout the state, but throughout the country. Of course, we have a very, very strong partnership with Texas Animal Health Commission and then TVMDL, the Texas A&M Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. And so we're real fortunate to have those relationships as we work through this pretty trying situation. Let me go ahead and share my screen with some slides. Let's see here. I think this gets us there. Okay. And so, what we're here to talk about today is something that has been very important to us, to our constituents. Many of you on this call, of course. It's something we've been very concerned about for several years, how this disease could impact Texas deer populations and the future of hunting in this state. And so today I'd like to give first just a very brief overview of the disease itself. I'm not going to get deep into the weeds on the CWD 101, but just hit some high points and then share with you, our experiences dealing with this disease in Texas, and hopefully attempt to clear up some misunderstandings out there and discuss why CWD is a big deal in this state. Unfortunately, we need to spend a little bit of time going over this because there has been a campaign over the past few years to marginalize CWD as a management issue. And, this campaign has been fairly intense, especially in social media. Some would like for you to believe that CWD is not even a disease. And there we go. And if so, certainly nothing more than a political disease. It's something that doesn't actually kill deer. Many of you have heard this. I'd be kidding myself if I claimed that there wasn't a political component to CWD. Certainly there is. But as I'll share with you today, this disease has real biological implications, and the political aspect can at times have a way of kind of compromising the effective and expedient management actions. But this is a neurological disease that occurs in at least some of the cervid species. Species in Texas that we know are susceptible to this disease include whitetails, mule deer, elk, red deer, sika. Of course, some of those are exotic. There's some research that suggests that axis deer probably are susceptible. But that fact hasn't been documented yet. We're actually initiating a research project to dig a little bit deeper into that. Wouldn't surprise us if there's other cervids in Texas that are susceptible to this disease. It's in a family of diseases known as transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, or TSEs. Other diseases in that family, they're very, very closely related. It would be scrapie in sheep, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE, in cattle, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in people, and there's several others that affect other species. This is a disease that's caused by misfolded prions. Now, prions are normal. Let me say normal prions are normal. It's something we all have. They play important roles, including regulating neurological processes. But when these prions misfold, these normal processes are disrupted, leading to this fatal neurological disease. It is a progressive, degenerative, and always fatal disease. But the thing that I think one of the things that probably makes, how do I say this, makes it hard for a lot of us to really grasp the seriousness of this disease is the fact that it is hard to see out there. It acts very slowly through it progresses very slowly through an individual animal. As you'll see in that third bullet on this slide, that incubation period is really long. Now, 4 years, that's going to be the upper limit most likely, but we're talking years in most cases, an incubation period of years. And so it progresses slowly through an animal, and then for obvious reasons, it then progresses slowly through a population, at least in the early years. And so it's not something that has a very obvious impact in the early years, like you see with, say, anthrax or EHD, that can leave a lot of carcasses on the landscape in a short period of time. And we'll touch on that here in just a minute. But to our knowledge, there's no treatment or vaccine, at least, certainly nothing that we know of today. This disease is spread very efficiently from animal to animal through direct contact, through bodily fluids such as saliva, urine, feces, etc. But one of the many things that makes this disease so challenging is the indirect transmission. The fact that a positive animal, way before it ever starts to show symptoms, in fact, even before they will test positive for this disease, they can be shedding this disease, these misfolded prions, into the environment. later exposing other animals and years later, based on what research has shown. And so it's something that, it's really hard to kind of get our hands around and fully understand, but it's something that can just stay out there on the landscape and continuing to affect animals, again, before you even know that the deer exist. It kind of reminds me of sometimes I'll use a typhoid Mary analogy to when I'm discussing this. Now, we first detected this disease in this state anyway in 2012 out in the Waco Mountains there in far west Texas. And this was a result of a strategic surveillance effort that we put together that summer after we received a call from our colleagues over with New Mexico Game and Fish. They called us that February and they said, hey, we just want to let you know, we tested 4 mule deer, hunter harvested mule deer within about a mile of your border there in the Waco Mountains, and 3 of them tested positive. Now, we knew that CWD had been in New Mexico. We knew it was in the Oregon Mountains there to the west or northwest where you see that star. But we did not realize that it was in the Waco Mountains and it was just right there knocking on our back door, so to speak. And so we put together that strategic surveillance effort that June or July, summer of 2012. And sure enough, we found the disease, which, most people would have expected based on the information we just received. But, it was really uneventful. We felt like we had a good response plan in place. We thought we had a good communication plan that had been implemented, and I think we've been given a situation where this disease might be more or less naturally contained, at least as far as natural disease expansion goes. Now, leading up to that detection, we had tested about 25,000 deer for this disease since 2002, which we acknowledge is fairly light surveillance on the statewide level. But yet we continued with that same routine surveillance effort for the next 3 years, collecting about 23 to 2,500 samples a year until this disease was detected in a captive deer facility in Medina County there in the summer of 2015. Now, this led to the first epidemiological CWD investigation within the Texas deer breeding community. And unlike what we'd seen in far west Texas, where the investigation showed that live deer had not been transferred out of that infected population, the epidemiological investigation in Medina County revealed that the source deer breeding facility had supplied deer to numerous locations throughout this state. In fact, that case involved 835 deer being transferred out to 145 different sites in Texas and 2 sites in Mexico. And that's just looking back during the previous 5-year period. Now, over the next year, CWD was detected in 4 additional deer breeding facilities. 3 of them there in Medina County, and 1 was a trace out facility from that index facility in Lavaca County. And the blue dots on this map represent the facilities that sold deer to those positive facilities within the previous 5 years. And the red dots represent the facilities that received deer from those positive facilities. And we learned that 75% of the deer breeders in Texas were connected to this index facility by no more than 2 degrees of separation. In other words, if we look at everyone that the CWD positive facility had received deer from or shipped deer to, which is what we call trace in and trace out facilities, and then we look at every breeding facility that those trace facilities sold deer to, which is what we currently call tier 1 facilities, 75% of the industry was touched. These deer in many cases are traded between individual facilities 3, 4, even 5 times, sometimes even more. And so we've got large aggregations of animals in these facilities that make disease transmission within a facility very efficient. And we've got numerous transfers back and forth, making disease transmission between facilities very efficient. And we knew, we had a good understanding of what deer breeding involved in this state. We've been, working and administering this program for many years. but it was really eye-opening to kind of see the spiderweb effect as this epidemiological investigation unfolded. Now, we became very concerned that CWD may have transferred to other deer populations throughout the state. And so we realized that we needed to intensify our surveillance efforts in order to detect this disease where it may have been transferred. So again, we've been averaging 23, 24, 2,500 samples a year for the first 12 to 13 years of our surveillance program. And if we were dealing with a more conventional disease with a more random distribution, we could say that our first 13 years of CWD surveillance was adequate to establish 99% confidence that the disease would have been detected even at very low prevalences of this disease within at least 9 of our 10 ecological regions in this state, provided that the disease occurred in one of those areas when this surveillance began back in 2002. But realizing that this is a focal or a cluster disease, meaning that it's not evenly distributed across the landscape, and that this disease may have been introduced to any one of these regions in more recent years, we realized that we had to begin to really surveil this at a finer scale and intensify our surveillance efforts. So without going too deep into the details today on what all that entailed, we did significantly increase our surveillance efforts back in 2015, which resulted in over 81,000 samples collected over the past 6 years. And this intensity helped us find this disease where it exists, particularly where it's existed for at least a few years. Now, we do realize that there could be some very recent introductions of this disease that have not yet been detected, or there could be some high-fenced ranches out there that have harbored this disease without any surveillance over the years. And so we're well aware of that. And we know that the models that have been used throughout this country really weren't developed for managing or surveilling for this disease. And I'll touch some more on that here in just a little bit. But it does give us some good idea that certainly across a free range landscape, if we're missing this disease, then we're going to be dealing with a recent introduction of the disease. Now, these numbers that you see on this map are not current numbers, but as you can see in that top right-hand corner, they indicate what we were aware of through 2021. Now, let's talk a little bit about how we respond to new discoveries of chronic wasting disease in this state. We established CWD zones, and we do this in an attempt to determine what the geographic extent of the disease is and the prevalence of the disease, but also, and probably most importantly, to contain the disease to that area. Now, the containment zones are shaded in red on this map, and the surveillance zones are shaded in yellow. And the requirements that are imposed on hunters are the same for both zones, for both the containment and the surveillance zones. And those requirements include mandatory sampling of hunter harvested deer and carcass movement restrictions, which basically means that the carcass has got to be quartered before leaving the site of harvest. And so we established check stations within these zones where hunters bring harvested deer to us, and we collect those samples and submit those for CWD testing. And of course, there are also some restrictions on the movement of live deer from these zones. And we do this, again, to contain the disease and to assess what the geographic extent and the prevalence of the disease is. So I mentioned a little bit ago about the 2015 detection of CWD in a deer breeding facility, our index case in Texas, as far as being within the permitted deer breeding community. And it was quite apparent that the surveillance requirements necessary for permitting the movement of live deer up to that point were inadequate. Immediately upon confirmation of that index case, we placed a moratorium on all deer movement until we could assess the situation and put safeguards to protect breeder deer as well as free-ranging deer populations. And we introduced those safeguards through a comprehensive CWD rule package, which was a byproduct of a very extensive stakeholder engagement. And those comprehensive CWD rules enhanced the CWD surveillance requirements to include antemortem testing. And that was the birth of antemortem testing for CWD outside of a research setting, not just in this state, but in this country. In fact, we remain the only state in the country that offers antemortem testing. We are aware that Pennsylvania has been approved here recently to do this as well, but they haven't initiated that just yet. And we continued under those enhanced rules with a revision in November of 2020, which required, some revisions, but one required more timely submission of the samples to the diagnostic lab. And then in March of 2021, CWD was detected in a couple of different deer breeding facilities that have been in operation for over 20 years. They're in Uvalde County and then up in Northeast Texas in Hunt County. And as that epidemiological investigation unfolded, we realized that our existing rules were still inadequate to detect this disease early and to prevent transmission of this disease to other facilities. Ultimately, we learned that 7 new CWD positive deer breeding facilities, we learned of 7 new facilities that year, and that this disease had gone undetected in 4 of those facilities for at least a year and likely longer than that, allowing for 270 trace out facilities scattered across 102 different, 2 different Texas counties to be exposed to this disease. And what was of greatest concern was the 1,700 or more than 1,700 deer that were transferred from those CWD positive deer breeding facilities to 103 different release sites in 56 counties, and the potential for additional or ongoing CWD transmission throughout the state. And what I mean here is that the trace reports that we had been compiling only identified the direct traces. In other words, those facilities that had transferred deer directly to a CWD positive breeding facility or received deer from a CWD positive deer breeding facility. But understanding how interconnected this network is, that approach left lots of room for CWD positive deer slipping through the cracks. And so to address those concerns and others, our commission adopted rule amendments, beginning with an emergency order issued by our executive director that summer to enhance, these rules enhanced our testing requirements for CWD exposed deer breeding facilities, as well as antemortem testing requirements for all breeder deer that were to be liberated. And this last rule I'm talking about, this live testing deer before release, that applies to all facilities, not just exposed facilities out there. And we believe this to be a critically important requirement, considering that about 1/3 of all breeder deer are released on an annual basis. And previously there was no surveillance for that segment of those breeder herds. Now, as I kind of alluded to a little bit ago, we're very proud to be the first state in this country to offer antemortem testing for the deer breeding community. And we do believe that this has been a tremendous tool to screen herds for CWD. Having said that, we also recognize the limitations of antemortem testing. For example, given the poor sensitivity of the test of deer that seem to be fairly common in this state, and I'm talking about deer with very common genotypes in this state, it looks like that we have a pretty good risk, a pretty high risk of missing a positive. And USDA and those who've studied and published these techniques have always advised us that antemortem testing not be used to clear individual deer, particularly deer that have been exposed to CWD. Now, this risk, I think, is mitigated to some degree by testing those deer prior to their liberation. These antemortem testing requirements that I'm talking about have indeed identified new CWD positive facilities in this state. Now, let me just stop and give a kind of a quick summary of where we've found CWD in this state to date. Again, we first found it out in the Trans-Pecos region, there in the Waco Mountains. You see a second star there to the west of that. That's in the Franklin Mountains there in El Paso. as I go advance through these animations, they're not necessarily in chronological order. Kind of first hitting the free range CWD that we're aware of, and then I'll also hit on where we know of CWD in captivity, or where it has been in captivity. And so we know of those situations in the Waco and Franklin Mountains. We've also detected this disease back in, I believe it was February of 2016, up in the Northwest Panhandle, Dallam and Hartley counties. It has also been detected in a single deer in Lubbock in an urban setting there. We're further investigating that one to see just how isolated that is. And then also in Del Rio, which does appear to be a very isolated situation. In fact, we have been conducting some research there and have a really good idea of the source of that disease there. And it appears to be a contained situation. Now, again, starting in 2015, we have 4 facilities over the course of 2015 and 16 in that Medina County area where the disease was detected. And then that other facility in Lavaca County, which was a trace out facility, that again was isolated in a contained situation there. Then I believe it's 2020 when the disease was found in a breeding facility in Kimball County. And then again, starting on March the 23rd of 2016 and continuing through that summer, CWD was found in 7 more facilities in this state. And then this past August and September, the disease was detected in 2 more deer breeding facilities, one in Gillespie and one in Limestone County. And then most recently here, just over the last couple of weeks, if you look and see that second star up there in Northeast Texas, it's a trace out release site, a site that had received breeder deer from that CWD positive facility in Hunt County that has now harvested a deer that was positive for CWD. Now, some of these CWD positive breeding facilities have been depopulated through indemnity agreements with USDA or through somewhat cautious alternative approaches that we offered, which allowed them to hunt bucks released from those facilities. But those 4 facilities that you see circled on this slide still maintain an inventory of deer, fairly large inventories. And the one down in Uvalde County, that southern or southwesternmost blue star, is really it's a very interesting case. We've got a herd plan agreement with them that provides an alternative to prompt and complete depopulation. And we're using genetics, longitudinal testing, and selective culling in an attempt to keep this disease out of the herd. A lot very, very similar to the way scrapie has been managed throughout this country for many years now. We've tried other alternatives to depopulation in some other facilities over the years, but unfortunately, those were, for lack of a better phrase, really failed experiments. We watched that disease. We thought we had some really cautious approaches to these alternative approaches, if you will. But nonetheless, we did watch this disease spread throughout those facilities and even onto their adjacent release sites in ways that we really don't fully understand. And so we've implemented some additional safeguards to some of these alternative strategies, including this genetic selection approach, which again would remove animals that are believed to be more susceptible to CWD and then breed for animals that are believed to be less susceptible for CWD. Again, very similar to how scrapie has been managed. Now, as for those other 3 facilities shown on this map, one currently has a formal indemnity request submitted to USDA for complete depopulation. And we've offered the other facilities, those other 2 alternatives to a depopulation as well. This disease, a lot of you know, has been cooking up in that northeasternmost facility for quite some time now. And you're really starting to see the disease, what happens when we allow a disease to remain on the landscape in a captive setting and fester. We've gone from having, I believe it was 14 positives just before August there to 52 known positives today. And so we're definitely seeing firsthand what can happen if this disease is allowed to fester in a captive setting. All right, so returning back to this slide from earlier in my presentation, I've talked a little bit about the disease itself. I've mentioned that it is indeed a fatal disease, and we've heard from some who like to say that no deer have ever died from CWD in Texas. This deer died from CWD, from clinical CWD. This is a deer in Texas. Here is that same deer. Here's a video. That's not a still shot. If you look closely, you'll see that's a video of that same deer just a few hours earlier than when that picture of that dead deer was taken. And this video was taken on someone's doorstep in El Paso. Now you can see this deer is oblivious to its surroundings. When I shared my screen a while ago, I did not click the right option for it to share the audio as well. It just dawned on me. But while you can't hear it, there's a dog in that house barking like crazy. His dog knows that deer is at the doorstep and is barking, and that deer is paying no attention whatsoever. And as you saw with that previous slide, I'll just back up and show you again. I mean, you can see a very emaciated deer there. Now, we've got other examples of deer dying from clinical CWD in this state. As you can imagine, though, we're going to put these deer at ease when we learn of this, rather than allowing the animal to continue to suffer from these horrible symptoms. But we're not always able to get to the deer before it succumbs to this disease. And I'll make one more point about this here in just a little bit. But we still hear from some who say that CWD is not a population limiting factor, that the populations with CWD continue to flourish, that there are other diseases that have much bigger impact on deer populations, and often citing anthrax and EHD. Of course, we don't really have a problem with EHD in our native deer herds, with very few exceptions, but we do acknowledge that it does have a significant impact on some breeder herds that have that northern blood, so to speak, and certainly a big impact on some of our neighboring states to the southeast. And we certainly agree that that disease and anthrax can and will result in much quicker and often dramatic short-term population declines. And we understand that they do have these short-term impacts on population, and this is, like I said, with EHD, especially been observed in the captive facilities. The one thing I think is hard to ignore, though, is the fact that there is nothing short-term about CWD. It doesn't go dormant, so to speak. If left unmanaged, it will only increase in prevalence. It will constantly act on the population and increase in prevalence, which is very, very different than what you see with anthrax and EHD. But, if we just step back and think about this a minute, when we consider the incubation period of this disease, you'd think that it wouldn't be a population limiting factor, because they very well could produce more young than more deer. They could produce more young after they become infected. But we've got to keep in mind that CWD is not the only mortality factor. It's an additional one, and it's one that, again, it increases where it exists, particularly where it's left unmanaged. Now, some people like to refer to Colorado and Wyoming to make their point that CWD is nothing to worry about. Those who have been studying this disease in those states for the past few decades have a very different opinion of that, and for very good reason. CWD had been impacting this population in eastern Wyoming for several years by the time the data collection effort began in 2001. And so as you see here, you see a data point there in 2001, and on that orangish colored bar, you're looking at CWD prevalence around 15%. It's actually the proportion of mature bucks that are getting harvested that test positive for the disease. And then on that little blue square up at the top, that's the mule deer, the estimated mule deer population. I made this slide in 2012. I got the data from Wyoming Game and Fish. You know, that's when we first found CWD in Texas. We started studying this again, you know, learning what other states have been learning from it. And they shared with me this data set. Obviously, it can be updated by now, but just take a look at what happens to this population as the prevalence of this disease increases. Now, keep in mind that we started at a 15% prevalence. This graph here starts at a 15% prevalence. That's really high, okay? It took no telling how many years it took for the disease to get to that point. But once it gets there, the literature suggests that's when you start to see these population level limiting factors. That's when you start to see the prevalence no longer plateaued, but really starting to take off and impact that population. And this is where we begin to see the impacts. I mean, with your own eyes out there, where hunters start to see the impacts. But when I made this slide back in 2012, at this point in my presentation, I would always say, but how much of that decline in that mule deer population was really a result of CWD? We all know that mule deer are pretty fragile. I mean, at least especially compared to white-tailed deer. There's lots of things acting on that population. There's other disease, there's drought. We can go on and on about all the factors against mule deer in our desert big game species. So how much of this was really a result of CWD? But what I didn't know at that time is that there was a long-term study being conducted in that very unit of Wyoming, investigating the effects of CWD on that white-tailed deer population. This previous slide, of course, was about mule deer, but what I'm sharing with you now was a white-tailed deer study in that unit led by Dr. Dave Edmonds. He actually had a colleague, though, who was studying the effects of CWD on the mule deer population in that same unit. And one thing that a couple things I'll highlight from their work was that, let's go back to that thought that CWD doesn't really kill deer. What Dr. Dave Edmonds showed was clinical CWD and hunter harvest were the top two mortality factors in that white-tailed deer population. When I say mortality factors, I mean direct causes of mortality. I'm not talking about the indirect causes, because we know other things can kill the disease first, which leads to the second bullet. CWD makes deer 4.5 times more likely to die in a year than deer in which the disease is not detected. We know that deer are more vulnerable to predation, vehicle collisions, hunter harvest, other disease, other mortality factors if they have CWD. And so when you take that into consideration, CWD is really the top mortality factor in these populations. Dr. DeVivo actually had very similar results in the mule deer population. What she showed was that predation and clinical CWD were the top two mortality factors in that population. Now, there's other studies with similar results. There's one going on in Wisconsin right now. I don't have recent data because they stopped providing reports after the first year, or second year rather. And they said they were going to wait till the study was concluded and then provide a final report. But after that first year, what they showed is that the annual survival of CWD positive deer was about 25% in that first year, as compared to 75% for whitetails in which the disease was not detected. There's been similar studies with elk as well. Now, then there's a thought that CWD has really been here a long time, but we're just now finding it because we're just now looking for it. I mean, some have even said it's been here for hundreds, thousands of years, I've heard. But again, we're just now finding it because we're just now looking. Some will even say that, hey, it's not even CWD, it's scrapie. We're not even looking for the right disease. And, we've been dealing with scrapie for so many years. We know that it's not a significant factor out there. So we're worrying a lot about nothing. here. And so we're hearing a lot of this, and I mean, even to this day. And folks, what I've got to say is there's a lot of time being wasted over things that don't even matter here. Whatever prion disease this is that we're dealing with, we know that it is highly contagious. We know that it is killing deer in these facilities and in the wild. And we know that it was spread between facilities with activation of a transfer permit. Even if this was scrape bee, the approach to managing this disease would not differ. Now, having said that, we've learned that this disease is not scrape bee. It could have originated from scrape bee, but through some research that we're doing, that we've been conducting over the last several years with some other partners who have been running Western blot tests on all of the CWD positives that our agency has submitted over the last couple of years. We know that what we're dealing with here is indeed CWD. Now, we do know that we're dealing with at least 2 different strains of CWD among the free-ranging sample, but because of the homogenate that's used to run the diagnostic test, they wouldn't be finding it if it was something other than CWD. But again, like I said, it could have originated from scrape bee. That's something we're very interested in. In fact, there's some publications out there, one very recent, that kind of supports the idea that scrape bee could jump to CWD and even vice versa, back to scrape bee in sheep. So it's pretty interesting. But if this is a disease that has been here on the landscape for hundreds of years, especially because we're talking about scrape bee, and we go back to this map showing 81,000 plus samples collected just over the last 6 years, if this is something that's been around forever, and if it's scrape bee itself, wouldn't we have at least one positive in the heart of the sheep and goat industry, the wool and mohair industry there in Central Texas? Yeah, I can draw that oval bigger. I know that. We do have the case in Del Rio, but we're well aware of, through some pretty extensive research there, on what the source of that disease is, which wasn't scrape bee. And we're also aware of the source of the disease where we found it in the Medina County area. So again, could certainly jump for scrape bee, but if it's something that's been here hundreds of years, it would be statistically impossible for us not to have hundreds, if not thousands, of positives throughout much of this state, in particular Central Texas. But again, I'll finish it with this. We can call it scrape bee. We can call it anything you want to call it. Either way, the prion disease that we're dealing with, it's infectious and it's deadly. It contaminates the environment, and as far as we know, it is impossible to eradicate once it becomes established. And unlike anthrax and EHD, it will continually increase in prevalence if left unmanaged. It won't go dormant. It won't take a break. It will continually act on that population. So I'll kind of wrap this up pretty quickly. I'll attempt to, but one last comment I'd like to make as far as why this is a big deal. Aside from the population level impacts, one thing that concerns us a lot is that hunters have told us throughout the country, survey after survey, they've told us if the prevalence gets beyond their comfort level, their threshold, they're going to pick up and they're going to go hunt somewhere else. Now think about that a minute. What would that mean to the economy for Llano, Texas, which we all know as the deer hunting capital of the world? What would it mean to them if this disease got established there and the prevalence got so high that it was beyond the hunter's comfort level, their threshold, and they picked up and went somewhere else? We know that we're well aware of the economic value of deer hunting in this state. It's been well researched for decades. We know that we're talking about a multi-billion outdoor economy that creates tens of thousands of jobs here. This is not a minor fact for us to be thinking about. Now, for the record, CWD has never been documented in Llano County, and we need to do whatever we can to keep it that way. And so as I wrap this up, I just like to convey that the management, that our management goals for this disease have been very, very simple. Our goals have been to keep it out where we don't have it. Where we do have it, contain it. And to help us do that, we need to be able to get the information necessary to better understand the geographic extent and the prevalence of the disease. And to do this, we've been using mandatory testing of hunter harvested deer in areas where we have CWD zones. We've used carcass movement restrictions in those same areas. And then we've had restrictions on the movement of live deer as well. That helps us achieve those goals. And so this here is my last slide, or second at last, and it's just to give me an opportunity to tell you just for a couple of minutes, let's talk a little bit about what the future looks like here in Texas with regard to our response plan. We've been operating under our current approach of delineating CWD zones since 2012, or some slight variation of that approach. And as you look at this, you may say, hey, there's some obvious inconsistencies with these zone delineations across the state. But I think we'll all agree that there's some good reason for that. I mean, we're trying to manage this disease across a very diverse landscape and across a diverse pool of host species. We know that the ground covered by mule deer and especially elk, for example, is much greater than that covered by white-tailed deer. Several factors have been considered each time that CWD zones are delineated in new areas. Factors such as, the deer biology, their movement, their ranges, natural and man-made barriers that may exist there on the landscape, easily defined features that are recognizable by hunters, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things that are taken into consideration. But we are currently developing some SOPs, if you will, to help us, help guide us through this zone creation and delineation in the future. And perhaps one of the most anticipated components of these SOPs is the section discussing the quote end game for these surveillance zones. That's been something that we've heard a lot about lately, and for good reason. A lot of people, we want to know, what's the future look like? We can't just continue indefinitely with this approach without some goals in place. And so we've had a hard time establishing those goals because, as I alluded to earlier, we're dealing with a model. Most states in this country have been dealing with a model to try to surveil for this disease that wasn't even developed for this disease, and certainly not for the situation that how we manage deer in this state. But we've been working here recently with an epidemiologist out of Emory University to develop a model that is much more applicable to this disease, and in particular, this disease on the Texas landscape, and to help us come up with some targets, some surveillance targets, not just numbers, but distribution of samples as well, to help us say, okay, you know what? We really don't have the disease in this surveillance zone. We can shrink this zone, or we can eliminate this zone. And we're going to brief our commission in January, at their next meeting in January, on kind of how this is developing, how we're working through this process. And we won't have a proposal at that time, but it's possible that we come back in March. That's ambitious, but possible we could come back as early as March with a proposal that could have some changes moving forward for how we're managing this disease in the state.